So welcome back to our verse-by-verse study through the Bible. We're now in Genesis chapter 21. We are talking about Abraham. We're right in the middle of his story. And this is kind of the culmination of everything that's been said from Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 20, where the Lord promised Abraham that he would make his seed as numerous as the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. Here is where the actual birth of Isaac happens in Genesis chapter 21. In verse 1, it says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken." You know, we also find out in that Sarah herself also believed God over in Hebrews chapter 11 when it's listing the heroes of faith. So it wasn't just Abraham, but Sarah believed God. She was 91 when she gave birth to Isaac, and Abraham was 100 years old. And we'll see that listed here, but it's also repeated in Romans chapter 4 and other places. In verse 2, it says, "For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken unto him." And so he was 100 years old. Romans chapter 4, verse 19 says, "And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body now dead when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb." You know, this is one of the major things that God has spoken unto me about faith, that faith isn't something that's hard to come by. Actually, every born-again believer has faith. It says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, that we're saved by grace through faith. You couldn't get saved without faith. In Romans chapter 12, verse 3, God dealt to every man the measure of faith. Not some measure of faith, but the measure of faith. And so you have faith. The problem isn't that we don't have enough faith. The problem is we got more than enough unbelief. And very few people try and limit the unbelief. And Abraham is a great example, especially that verse in Romans chapter 4, verse 19, where it says he considered not. The word consider means to study, ponder, deliberate, examine, think upon. Abraham didn't even think about the fact that he was 100 years old and that Sarah, the scripture says, that had ceased to be with her after the manner of women. That means that she had been through menopause and it was physically impossible for her to have children. If for some reason you wanted a child at 100 years of age and your wife was 91, I think most people, if God was to tell them that, they wouldn't be pleased with that. But this is what Abraham had been believing for his entire life. And if God had spoken to you and told you that you were going to have a child and your wife was 91, most of us would have gone to the doctor and would have gotten tests to find out, can this happen? We would have gotten on the internet and we would have researched to find out what the oldest person, how old a person was when they gave birth to something. And we would have accumulated all of this unbelief that says, no, it's physically impossible. It can't happen. And then we'd go back and try and believe. See, it's not that we don't have faith, it's that we consider all of these other things. But Abraham considered not his own body now dead. This is a tremendous example right here. And it wasn't because Abraham was such a great man of faith. If somehow or other you could put him into a time machine, and if you could just translate Abraham into our day and age, and if you could have him read all of the stuff that you read on your phone or on your computer, if you had him look at all of the news, if you had him plugged into this world system the way that you are, and if he considered all of this unbelief and all of the natural reasons against believing God, he wouldn't have had any more faith. He wouldn't have had any more victory than what you have. And on the other hand, if you could put yourself into a time machine and just zip yourself back to Abraham's time where he didn't have all of this unbelief, and God had given him a sign that during the daylight hours he had to deal with dust on his feet all day long, and every time he saw dust on his feet, it says, so shall your seed be. At night, he was out where he saw the stars, and so every night he was thinking, so shall my seed be. If for 26 years you had just day and night been focused on what God said and not listening to all of the unbelief and all of the doctors and all of the people who were telling you it's just impossible, then you would have had just as much success as Abraham had. It's not that he had more than we have, he had less. This is really, really important. And I've got a great teaching on this, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 15. You cannot be tempted with something that you don't think. The problem is most of us think on things we should not be thinking on, and because of it, we have unbelief and a lot of negative things coming at us, and it's hindering our faith. In Matthew chapter 17, verse 20 and 21, it's not faith that's the problem, it's unbelief that is the problem. Man, that is awesome. In verse 3, it says, And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare unto him, Isaac. And again, this is according to the word that was given unto him in the 17th chapter, when the Lord gave this covenant of circumcision and told him that Ishmael wouldn't be his son, but one born out of his own bowels would be his son. It says that Abraham laughed, and because of that, God named the child Isaac, because it means laughter. So in chapter 18, this is Genesis chapter 18, and in verse 12, when the Lord came to Sarah, she laughed, but her laugh was a laughter of disbelief and unbelief, and because of it, she was rebuked. In verse 4, it says, And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. That's Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 through 12, was the command to do this on the 8th day after the birth of a son. In verse 5, it says, And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. Man, this is awesome. And did you know that this didn't just happen briefly and somehow or another he was miraculously healed? He got married after Sarah died, and he had children well on up into his 150, 160 years old. He lived to be 175 years old. So when God healed Abraham, he healed him. Amen. And he had many more children after this. Sarah was 91 at this time, and Sarah lived to be 127 years old. Abraham was 160 years old when his grandsons Esau and Jacob were born. Again, I'm throwing out these figures, and I'm not taking time to verify it, but if you were to get my living commentary, which I'm using to teach verse by verse through here, I've got all of the references showing you exactly the scriptures that prove all of these things that I'm saying. And to me, this really puts things into perspective. You know, the way that the scripture lists things, it talks about Abraham, and in Genesis chapter 25 and 26, basically in chapter 25, it talks about the death of Abraham, but he actually lived for quite a while after that portion of Scripture was over, and he saw Jacob and Esau lived to be, I think it was 15 years old. And so this will really help you. I've got an age chart in my living commentary that'll go into detail on that. In verse 6, it says, And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear shall laugh with me. And again, the name Isaac meant laughter. In verse 7, she said, Who would have said unto Abraham, that Sarah should have given children suck, for I have borne him a son in his old age. You know, Sarah, the whole purpose in the command that God had given Abraham about having children, Sarah, we don't know exactly when they married, but he was 75 when he came into the land of Canaan. He had married Sarah before that, and he was 100 when Sarah gave birth. So this was at least 25, 26 years, and probably it had been closer to 50 years that she had been seeking to have a child, and she had never been able to have one. She wanted one so badly that she gave her handmaiden Hagar to Abraham. And so this was the fulfillment of something that she had been believing for probably 40, 50, or even longer. And here she is just rejoicing. So not only was this a blessing to Abraham, but I'm sure that, Sarah, her last days, she lived 27 years after this. I believe that must have really made her rejoice to have this child in her old age. In verse 8, it says, The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. You know, I've read a number of commentaries on this, and most commentaries believe that they nursed a child until 3 to 5 years old. And that seems really long according to us, but I believe that that is probably what happened here. And that'll make more sense when you see that Ishmael and Isaac were having a fight. I mean, if he would have been just a little tiny baby, it wouldn't have made any sense. But if he was 5 years old, that would make this more understandable. I've actually got a friend of mine. He's now gone on to be with the Lord. He was probably 30 years older than me. But back when I was a kid, I remember him talking about that he was 4 years old when he got weaned, and that was in the 1900s. And so this may be strange to us today, but I think that's the way it was done back then. And in verse 9 it says, "And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne unto Abraham, mocking." So again, I think you have to understand that Isaac was probably at least 4 or 5 years old at this time. And you have to also remember that Sarah is the one who caused this whole problem. The Lord told Abraham in the 15th chapter of Genesis, he asked the Lord, he says, this steward, Eliezer, who ran his house, was his heir. And he says, how are you going to fulfill this promise of my children be as numerous as the stars in the sky, or all of these things, if I only have this? I haven't had a child myself, and this steward is going to be my heir. He said, no, it'll be someone that comes out of your own bowels. And so Abraham and Sarah tried to help God. They gave Sarah's handmaid, Hagar, an Egyptian, to Abraham to have sexual relationships with. And Sarah is the one who came up with this idea. You need to remember that. And so she said in verse 10, she said, wherefore she said unto Abram, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And so Sarah became angry at Hagar and at Ishmael. There was contention here because of the things that she started. Did you know Ishmael never was God's perfect will? You'll find out in the next chapter when the Lord told Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he says, take your son, your only son, Isaac. In God's eyes, this was the only son. Now, that didn't mean that God wasn't aware that Ishmael existed, and he made promises. Matter of fact, right here in this chapter, he heard the cry of the child, and he made promises to him about also being a great nation and many nations coming out of him. So it's not saying that God didn't know that he existed, but as far as God was concerned, that was not the promised seed. And so this whole thing was never God's will. And this just shows you some of the problems it has that comes from having multiple wives. That's one of the reasons that the Lord said that polygamy was not God's will. He allowed it under the old covenant because of the hardness of people's hearts, but in the new covenant, he said that a man should be the husband of one wife. And so this just illustrates some of the problems that come from this. And so she said, cast out this bondwoman. And this is a major point made of this in Galatians chapter 4. Paul is talking about that the bondwoman and her son Ishmael are symbolic of the Jews that didn't know Jesus. And Isaac was symbolic of the true church, the people that had the faith of Abraham, not just the physical blood of Abraham flowing in their veins. And it says that this Ishmael was symbolic of Jerusalem, which was in bondage, and Isaac was symbolic of the true church, and there's always going to be contention between them, and that the Lord said, cast out the bondwoman, reject the child that was born out of the flesh. And so, of course, this was a physical thing that happened with Abraham, but spiritually or symbolically, this is talking about people who just claim to have a relationship with God, but they don't have the true blood of God flowing in them. They aren't the true born-again people of God. And there's a major point made out of that in Galatians chapter 4. It's going back to this exact verse right here. This is the reason that we need to know the Word of God verse by verse to get the full impact of what's being said. In verse 11, it says, and the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. So what this does is reveal that Abraham had become attached unto Ishmael and unto Hagar. And that doesn't mean that he loved them more than he loved Isaac. Isaac was the seed of the promise, but nonetheless there was an attachment here, and you can see that in Abraham's reaction. And this is one of the reasons that the Lord told the Jews not to marry into the people that inhabited that land, because if they would have formed marriage relationships and had children and grandchildren, then when the Lord told them to go in and destroy all of the inhabitants of the land, which according to Genesis chapter 15, God was giving them an extra 400 years, but he was going to bring judgment on them, and he told them to go in and kill the men, the women, the children, everybody, and not allow anybody to exist because they would turn their hearts away from the Lord. If they would have had these marriages, interrelationships, they would have formed these bonds with these people, and it would have made it very, very hard for them to execute what God said. And you can see that right here with Abraham, that he was affectionate towards Ishmael, who was not God's will. This was never a part of his plan. And so the Lord told him to do as Sarah had said. In verse 12, it says, God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of thy bondwoman, and all that Sarah has said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And again, in the physical realm, there was all kinds of problems that existed with this, but spiritually speaking, there can be no compromise between knowing God personally, having a personal relationship with the Lord, which is what Isaac symbolized, versus just having a physical some acknowledgement of God, which is what Ishmael symbolized. And so there had to be a clear distinction between the two. And I tell you today, the lines between those who truly know God and those who are just Christian in names only, it's skewed, and it's hard to tell sometimes, but there should be a clear break between those two. In verse 13, it says, and also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. And so God assured Abraham that he would also be kind and prosper Ishmael. In verse 14, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Did you know later on, this is after these things, but in the 25th chapter, I think it is, it talks about that Abraham remarried Keturah, and he had many more children, and he sent all of those children away. He gave them lots of gifts. He gave them money. He sustained them, but he sent them away from Isaac, because Isaac was the one whom God had chosen to be the descendant that God would bless the whole world through. But Abraham was generous to these other children through Keturah, and I suspect that he probably gave Hagar more than just a little bit of bread and water. But anyway, this is what it records right here. In verse 15, it says, and the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. Now, you got to remember, at this time, Ishmael was at least 17 years old, probably closer to 20 years old is what most of the scholars believe. And so this wasn't like a little tiny baby. But he was a young man. Things might have been different back in that culture, I don't know. But anyway, she put him a far piece off from her so that she wouldn't have to watch him die. Apparently, they were dying of thirst. The water in the bottle was spent. And in verse 16, it says, and she went and sat down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot. For she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. You know, if Hagar had been operating in the faith of the words that God had given her way back in, I think it was the 16th chapter of Genesis, there was conflict between her and Sarah, because when she got pregnant, she despised her mistress, and she began to start talking about how she was favored and she was able to have children and Sarah wasn't. And so because of it, Sarah got mad, and Hagar ran off. And so it looked like that the child was going to die in that situation. But an angel of the Lord appeared unto her and told her that he would make of her a great nation, and that multiple nations would come out of this child that was going to be born. Now, this was when she was only pregnant. So the Lord had already spoken to her and given her prophecy. If Hagar had been operating in faith, she could have used that faith right here. But apparently this shows that Hagar was just expecting Ishmael to die, contrary to the word that God had given her. And in verse 17 it says, and God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, what aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. So the Lord not only heard Hagar's prayer and intercession, but also heard Ishmael. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but the Lord has always dealt with people, all people, not just the Jews. The Bible focuses on the Jews, and sometimes it gives the impression that God was only dealing with Jews. But here was Ishmael, who was not a Jew. God heard him. He heard the voice of Hagar, and he answered their prayer. And in verse 18 it says, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. You know, this doesn't say that the Lord just created the well. Apparently it was already there, but she hadn't seen it. The Lord opened up her eyes. And I'm not exactly sure in the physical realm what this is talking about, but spiritually speaking, this is something that is really applicable to all of us. That when we're in a hard spot, we tend to just look at the negatives that are involved in this, what we don't have. But the truth is, there's always a way to escape. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says, "There is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man, who God will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it." So regardless of what you're going through, there's always an escape. There's always something else, but you have to have the Lord open up your eyes. And most of us just get fixated on all of the negatives. We go over and over and over the negatives in our mind, and often that blinds us to the provision that is right there. I believe that there was probably a well already there, but she just wasn't looking at it. She was just looking at the negatives in this situation. Likewise, there's always an answer to every problem that we ever go through, and we just have to have the Lord open up our eyes so that we can see what the answer is. In verse 20 it says, "And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife of the land of Egypt." The wilderness of Paran was way south of the Dead Sea. It was down closer actually towards the Gulf of Aqaba. And this is ultimately the area where Edom came out from, and Petra down there. In verse 22 it says, "And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest." Now remember, back at the first of this chapter, that this is the king that had taken Sarah into his harem, and he reproved Abraham for lying to him about Sarah being his sister. And so he had the opportunity. He could have been offended, but apparently this man was big enough to get beyond what Abraham had done to him by lying to him about his wife, and he actually saw that the blessing of God was upon Abraham. And so Abraham had Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of the host, come unto him and say that God is with you in all that you do. You know, would to God that every one of us could be reflecting the power of God in our life so much that people would come and say, we see that the blessing of God is on you. Sad to say, if there was a lot of Christians arrested for being a blessing, there wouldn't be enough evidence to convict them. There is not that much evidence in most people's lives, but we should be walking in the blessing of God so much so that other people see it. In verse 23, it says, "Now therefore swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned." So he asked to make a covenant with Abraham, not only for himself, but also for his son and his son's son, which is his grandson. So this is 3 generations. The Lord had told Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 that in the 4th generation, his descendants would inherit that land and that they would come in and dispossess all of the people who were living there. So this fell within that time frame. And he made a covenant that for 3 generations, he would not do harm unto them. In verse 24, it says, "And Abraham said, I will swear. And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away." In other words, this was a violation of the covenant. the covenant wasn't just one-sided, that Abraham wouldn't do evil unto them, but the covenant was also that Abimelech would treat Abraham properly. And so Abimelech's servants violently took a well away from Abraham, and so he mentioned that to Abimelech, and Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but today. In other words, Abimelech is saying that he didn't violate the covenant, maybe his servants did, but that wasn't something that he authorized. In verse 27, and Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, what mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, for these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. So he made the covenant, and there were some animals that were in exchange for that. But then Abraham also, in a sense, set these 7 ewe lambs by themselves as a special way of buying this well that Abraham had dug. And did you know most people would look at this as a bad deal and say that, man, he already had dug it. He didn't have to pay anything. It was his. He shouldn't have done this. But did you know Abraham was a blessed man? Money is not that big of a deal. Relationships are much, much, much more important than money. And I tell you, this is something that I am learning. I'm not saying that I've gotten this all figured out, but you know, I remember one man who, he served me for a long time, and he was a blessing, and he did a lot of good things in the ministry, but he was just mean and hard, and people were being hurt, and I eventually had to let him go. And it was kind of a bad situation. Plus, at that time, he had cancer, and he was going through cancer treatments. And if I fired him, he not only was going to lose his job and lose his income, but he was going to lose his health insurance. And these treatments for cancer were very high. So you know what I did? Even though it was proper that I fired him, and I could give you all of the details, I could have employees come and verify the things that I'm saying, but man, I mean, all of my employees breathed a sigh of relief because he was hard-nosed, and he hurt a lot of people. He did a lot of good, but there was damage that went along with it. And so anyway, because of that, I would have been fine to have fired him there. I was justified because of the things that he did. But you know, I decided to give him a year's salary, severance pay, and I bought him a special insurance policy and paid for his insurance so that he could go through all these treatments with cancer. And some people would look at that and think, that's a terrible deal. You didn't have to do any of that. You lost all of this money. But to me, relationships are more important than money is any day. And I've done this not only with that one employee, but I've done it with a number of people. And in a sense, that's what Abraham is doing right here. He had rights to that well. He didn't have to offer Abimelech anything. It was his by rights. He dug it. But you know what? 7 ewe lambs was a small price to pay just to solidify that this is my well, and here is a payment. Now you let your servants leave me alone and let my servants use this well. I think that was wisdom, and this gives an insight into Abraham and the type of person that he was. In verse 31, it says, wherefore he called that place Beersheba, which means well of the oath, because there they swear, both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And so, you know, this is the same thing that it said about Enoch. It says that he called on the name of the Lord. It also said the same thing about Noah. And we don't know exactly what that means, but it's talking about that he worshiped the Lord. He didn't worship the Lord in order to get something from him. This was worshiping the Lord for the favor and the blessing that he had already given him in the well of this oath, and that this contention between Abimelech and Phicol had been settled, and so he offered a sacrifice and worshiped the Lord because of it. In verse 34, and Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. Actually, he spent the rest of his life there. So he was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and he lived to be 175. So that was at least 75 years after this time that he lived in that area. So that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 21. There's only 1,168 chapters to go in the Bible.